Our cognition follows our visual environment. So what does this mean for workspace optimization? Well, most of us listening to particular sounds can enhance our cognition. There's a really nice paper. I will post a link to this. The title of the paper is The Influence of Ceiling Height, the Effect of Priming on the Type of Processing that People Use. And I won't go into all the details of this paper, but what's really cool about this paper is they looked with very rigorous statistics, and they have a fair number of subjects, and everything about this paper looks solid to me, at the difference in cognitive processing and abstract thinking and detailed analytic work that people are able to perform in environments that have a 10-foot ceiling versus an 8-foot ceiling, which is not that much of a difference. It's just two foot difference there. And what they found were significant effects whereby high ceilings activate concepts related to abstraction, whereas low ceilings prime confinement-related concepts but promote the kind of detailed thinking that lends itself well to sort of spreadsheet type work or accounting type work, whereas abstract creative work was supported by these higher ceilings. And the way they analyzed this was really interesting. Again, we don't have time to go into all the details, but they asked people to sort of generate word sets related to particular topics like sports, and so people would talk about soccer, football, baseball, golf, etc., and talk about some of the equipment and other things. And then they had a kind of a challenge, a cognitive challenge, whereby people had to link different concepts along different dimensions, so that you depart from the dimension of sport and you start thinking about, sports that involve teams or sports that involve a ball, etc. And so in the same conditions, you can, except for the fact that the ceiling height is different, 8 feet or 10 feet, what one finds is that the kinds of language and the kinds of associations that people start to create are vastly different. And there are actually 2 experiments in this study. You're welcome to go look at it. So it wasn't just about sports. There were some other things that were analyzed as well. And in the references of this paper, it also points to other examples now of the cathedral effect, which I find very interesting because as a vision scientist and someone who spends his life thinking about and indeed talking about the nervous system, we know that our cognition follows our vision. For low vision or blind people, it will follow mostly their hearing and to some extent their touch. But for most people who are sighted, as most people are sighted, our cognition follows our visual environment. So what does this mean for workspace optimization? Well, most of us have a fixed ceiling level in our home, but you might have rooms in which the ceiling is higher and rooms in which the ceiling is lower. If that were the case, I recommend if you want to do creative work during phase 2, the 9 to 16 hours of your circadian cycle, 9 to 16 hours after waking, that is, that you do that in the high ceiling room, or maybe even outdoors, out on a deck or on a patio, because the highest ceiling, of course, is the sky. Whereas if you're going to do detailed analytic work, I would suggest doing that during phase 1 of the day. But even if you're going to do it during phase 2 of the day, for whatever reason, scheduling or other sorts of constraints, that you do that in the lower ceilinged environment. Now, if you are interested in controlling the height of your visual world, but you don't have control over the ceiling height of the environment that you're in, there's another way to do that. And I used to observe this in the cafes in and around Stanford in the Bay Area, where you would see somebody who, despite the weather, would be in a hoodie, maybe with a baseball cap or other form of hat, or some sort of blinder above their eyebrows, which is actually another way of just lowering the ceiling height very, very low and restricting your visual field. Not unlike blinders that we talked about before that one would put on a horse or one would put on themselves by restricting their visual angle of focus to directly in front of them, but not too far out beyond the sides of their head. So these cathedral effects, I think, can be leveraged toward doing particular types of work best. And again, the lower the ceiling or the lower your visual environment, the more that one tends to do, or I should say, performs detailed analytic work accurately. And the more that one's thinking is oriented towards detailed, sort of correct answer type work. Whereas when the ceiling is higher or there's no ceiling, the more that the brain and the rest of the processing that we call cognitive processing is related to abstract reasoning, brainstorming, and indeed can pull from broader swaths of memory resources. Because really what abstract reasoning is it's taking existing elements and maneuvering them or arranging them into novel ways. So you can think about like notes on a piano, playing a particular song, learning scales. That's very analytic. There's a correct answer that you're trying to arrive at or generate. Whereas writing music or writing poetry or generating new material of any kind involves taking existing elements, right? You're not going to use words that you don't have committed to your memory or that you're not aware of, and arranging them in novel ways. So I think the cathedral effect can be leveraged. And again, you don't need to move into a different home or build a slanted roof and work at one side of the room at one part of the day and the other side of the room at the other. Although, hey, if that's the way you want to swing it, that's great. Most of us don't have that flexibility. But it's very clear that the height of the ceiling of the visual environment that we're in has a profound effect on the types of cognitive processes that we are able to engage. Now I'd like to shift our attention to the auditory environment, or the noise in the room, or the music in the room, or the music or noise in the headphones, because it turns out that there is a lot of quality scientific data out there that speaks to whether or not listening to particular sounds can enhance our cognition. And indeed, the answer is yes, but there are very particular types of things to listen to under very particular types of conditions that allow one to do that. First off, I want to say that people vary tremendously in the extent to which they can tolerate background noise for work. In fact, individuals will vary tremendously from one day to the next, or even within the same day, in the extent to which they can tolerate background noise. I've experienced this myself. There have been times in which I've been working at home and I felt like, for whatever reason, I just could not engage in focus. And what worked to generate more focus for me was to go to a cafe or to a library or someplace where there's actually more commotion, more people moving about, maybe even more noise, maybe even music in the room. And we have to all be in touch with when we want more background noise or when we want less background noise. There is no hard and fast rule. If you look across the literature for studies that involve complete silence or white noise or binaural beats or music or classical music or rock and roll, you can find results to support any type of environment as being more beneficial. However, as we'll talk about in a moment, there are a few types of environments to really avoid and a few types of sounds that really can enhance the cognition and your ability to focus in your workspace environment across the board that really seem to work for all people. Let's talk about background noise to avoid. And here we're talking about background noise to avoid because it actually can cause some pretty severe deficits in cognition. There's a paper, first author Jordan Love, cool name, last author Alexander Francis. The title of the paper has to do with psychophysiological responses to potentially annoying heating, ventilation, and air conditioning noise during mentally demanding work, which is a mouthful. But basically, what this paper identifies is a large data set in which workplace and environmental noise, mostly the humming of air conditioners that's very loud or the humming of heaters that's very loud and ongoing, just incessant, doesn't let up, can really increase mental fatigue and can vastly decrease cognitive performance. And if you're interested in looking at the cognitive performance data, the authors are Banbury and Berry, 2005. That paper is the one that supports the fact that cognitive performance is worse when there's just the hum of an air conditioner in the background or the hum of a heater and otherwise complete silence. There's also evidence, which I discussed on the episode about hearing, which is that in young children, white noise can cause some impairments in the development of the auditory system. Now, I don't want parents to freak out, and if you were exposed to white noise as a sleep aid as a child, which I know many of you were, don't freak out. But it turns out that white noise, especially if it's loud white noise, can cause some disruption in the auditory maps, the representation of different frequencies of sound in the brain that can lead to some deficits in auditory and even language processing. So we really have to be careful about long-term exposure, extended exposure to white noise or kind of air conditioning noise that's really at a high level. I wouldn't worry if it's in the background and it's shutting off and turning on again as the thermostat kicks off and on, but really trying to avoid work in loud, fan-filled or ventilation-generating or heat-generating environments because it really can cause damage to the auditory system long-term. And as we described, it can impair cognitive performance and overall increase fatigue. I think we've all experienced that when you're in a room and there's some ongoing background noise and all of a sudden it stops and you just feel this enormous relief. And the reason for this is that our auditory system has a parallel to our visual system.